Hello, everybody. My name is Jonathan Fischer from Cascade Rail Foundation, and today is November 28th, 2025. Here's hoping that everybody had a great holiday yesterday. Today we have a program on the Milwaukee Road, the White River Branch, the Enumclaw line, presented by our master historian, Alan Miller. So sit back and enjoy today's program, and we'll be back at the end of the program for Q&A then. Enjoy.
Today my program is about the Milwaukee Road's Enumclaw line, originally known as the White River Branch. And it was a branch line that came off of the main line at Bagley Junction, 4 miles below Cedar Falls, and ran 18 miles to Enumclaw. The first indications that something was happening were in the December 4, 1910 Coast Division timetable, when the station Bagley Junction suddenly appears located 4 miles west of Moncton. Now, the first portion of the branch from Bagley Junction to Selleck was built in 1909 and 1910 by the Seattle and Southeastern Railway Company. And this was a logging railroad that was controlled by John Bagley of Tacoma Eastern fame. So there's the origins of the station named Bagley Junction. Now, it's possible that John Bagley was intending to extend the Seattle Southeastern Railway's lines to connect with his Tacoma Eastern Railroad at perhaps the station of Ashford, because in addition to logging interests, this country where the Seattle Southeastern was also coal country. And so it's possible that he was wanting to ship coal deposits via his Tacoma Eastern Railroad, but that's all just speculation. But the Milwaukee Road bought the section from Bagley Junction to Selleck, which is roughly around 2 miles, and took ownership of that on February 13th, 1912. Now, here's the layout at Bagley Junction, and the junction switch is here. You'll see that there's a short siding here called a doubling track, and that's because the grade from here up to Selleck was considerable, even reaching 2.78% in one place. So trains often had to double the hill, where they would set out half their train down here in the siding and take half of it up to Selleck and then come back down and get the other half. And then we see the Northern Pacific's Green River Branch going up to Carriston. And then Barneston was a company town that was owned by the Kent Lumber Company, and they had a big sawmill here. But while we're at Bagley Junction, I'll relate a tragedy that happened here. On the morning of Wednesday, July 10th, 1912, two sisters from Enumclaw, and Miss Bessie Grace Montgomery and Miss Agnes Montgomery, who was an Enumclaw school teacher, and a man from Buckley took the Enumclaw passenger train to Bagley Junction for the purpose of picking wild huckleberries, and for the women to visit their married sister, Mrs. Elizabeth Daisy Montgomery Trana, who went by the name Lizzie. And she lived near Bagley Junction, and her husband probably worked at the Kent Lumber Company in the mill, perhaps. Anyway, after spending the day picking berries, they met up at Bagley Junction to ride the evening train back to Enumclaw. And at the junction, they were joined by a Mrs. Alice Jessie Marston, the wife of Walter Douglas Marston, who was a mill employee of the Palmer Lumber Company at Palmer. And Mrs. Trana's husband, Mr. Trana, also joined them there. Now, the Enumclaw local passenger train from Seattle had already gone through going eastbound and ran up to Cedar Falls, where they would then turn on the Y and come back down. And then that would stop here at the switch, line the switch into the branch line and pull in, and then they'd have to stop to line the switch back for the main line. And while they were stopped, then the passengers who met here where this X is could then board the train and ride it back to Enumclaw. And so they were waiting for the train to return back from Cedar Falls. But what they didn't know was that the westbound Olympian train number 15 that was normally due through Bagley Junction at 6:30 p.m. was running an hour and 20 minutes late that evening, and he left Cedar Falls ahead of the Enumclaw train. And so as they stood here talking on the tracks, they saw a headlight coming, but they figured it was the Enumclaw train would stop to line the switch. And by the time they realized their mistake, the train was already on top of them. Now, the men and Agnes Montgomery were able to jump to safety on the opposite track, but the other three women hesitated in their fright and were struck by the engine. Now, Mr. Trana was partially successful in trying to pull his wife to safety, but she sustained severe head injuries. And the other two women were killed at the scene. And Bessie was age 19 and Mrs. Marston was 28. Within minutes, the train for Enumclaw arrived, and so the remains of the two dead women and the injured Mrs. Trana were placed aboard, and the train made a quick emergency run to Selleck, where they gained access to the Northern Pacific to Canasket, and then made arrangements to use the Northern Pacific line to Henry Switch, which was a connection to the Columbia and Puget Sound Railway line's Black Diamond branch. There, the train backed up 9/10 of a mile to a point then called Summit, later known as Danville, where they were met by a special train on the Columbia and Puget Sound for an emergency run to Seattle. And portions of Mrs. Trana's skull were removed in the hospital to try and save her life, but she later died of her injuries. She was 24 years old. So quite the tragedy there at Bagley Junction. At the end of this program, I'll tell another story about Bagley Junction that has a happier ending. So the line beyond Selleck was built to a connection with the White River Lumber Company at Enumclaw Junction. And and then the Milwaukee had the running rights over the White River Lumber Company for 1.9 miles from Enumclaw Junction to Enumclaw. So one of the perks of being the agent at Enumclaw was that you were also the train dispatcher between Enumclaw Junction and Enumclaw. And it's unknown if the dispatcher just controlled that 1.9 miles of railroad, or if he was a train dispatcher for the whole White River Lumber Company. Or he may have had to coordinate with a logging dispatcher up at Ellenson to dispatch his trains. That stuff isn't known, but what we do know is that J.W. Stevenson was the first agent in Enumclaw from April 1911 till September 1913, when he was promoted to the Division Freight and Passenger agent out of Tacoma. Well, then Ralph V. Cummings became the agent here from September 1913 until November of 1915, when then he was promoted to the Division Freight and Passenger Agent out of Seattle. So then Derek W. Bowe became agent from November 1915 until November of 1920. And then he bid in the agency at Auburn on the Tacoma Black River Joint Line. So then Richard P. Roselle became agent and train dispatcher from November 1920 until October 1921. And then Derek W. Bowe got into trouble in Kent, or Auburn, and he ran afoul of the Union Pacific there and had to give up the agency. So he came back to Enumclaw in October 1921 and remained the /train dispatcher until they stopped running over the White River Line in September 1933. Now, next to Enumclaw, Selleck was the busiest station on the line, and it was a logging and sawmill operation here. And here's a look at the track layout here, and this is a map from 1911, and we see that the Milwaukee line here, and they had a passing track and a connection to the logging road, and then they have this interchange track that connected directly to the logging railroad. Now, on this side, it was known as Miller's Logging Road. And despite my name being Miller, I haven't been able to find out much about that operation. But this is the area of Kangley in here, and that's probably the Kangley store right there. But it crossed the Milwaukee Road line at grade here, and then on this side of it, it became the Seattle and Southeastern Railway. So kind of a mystery there. But Seattle Southeastern had a continuation of their line from Bagley Junction down here to various logging camps, and they had a big sawmill here. So we got the sawmill and the commissary, bunkhouses, the office, and then the Milwaukee Road facilities here was a freight house and a platform, and later they had a pasture shelter here. And this is a county road there. We can see here the dividing line, Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railway this direction, and former Seattle and Southeastern Railway that direction. And we'll jump to a bigger picture of Selleck here. And over here we got Kangley Junction here, and this is where the Northern Pacific line continues on up to Carriston. And then we have the Miller's Logging Road there. That's the tie-in between the Northern Pacific and the Seattle Southeastern. And then the Milwaukee facilities down here. We got the 1,654-foot passing track, and then they had a 610-foot interchange track that could hold 14 cars that connected to the logging railroad. Now we show here it's Miller's Logging Railway at grade, but the timetables don't show any crossing at grade here at all with any railroad. And it wasn't until August 5th, 1917 that they finally started showing a grade crossing here, but they list it then as a crossing with the Northern Pacific Railway, which they ultimately took over this Miller's Logging Road, and that became what they called their Selleck Spur. And but it's still shown as Seattle Southeastern over on this side, and then the line continued on to their logging camps. And then Milwaukee also had a connecting track to their log dump. And so here's their mill pond here, and they had a rollway and a log dump, and they had an 818-foot passing track. So that means they could put about 20 log cars in here at the dump. And the difference between a dump and a rollway, at least to my knowledge, is a dump is where you just dump the logs off the cars and they hit the pond with a big splash. A rollway, I think, is an inclined ramp where the logs just roll down into the water. And why they had the need for both, I have no idea. But there's a dam here to form the mill pond. And then up here is a road that was known as the Selleck Cedar Falls Road, and it was a shortcut drive to get to Cedar Falls from here. And here's some logs at Selleck that are destined for that log dump and to the pond. Pretty good sized logs too. And ultimately destined for this mill. This was the sawmill at Selleck, and portions of this mill are still there. Years ago, I took a motorcycle up the abandoned Enumclaw line and came out up here at Selleck and explored around the mill here. There were still some concrete walls standing, and you could see where the mill pond was because of all the sediment on the ground there. But it was a busy logging camp and quite a community at one time. They even big enough to have a hotel here, and they had a schoolhouse. The Milwaukee Road timetable carried special instructions in there that their passenger train would stop at Durham and Bagley Junction to pick up school children to attend the school at Selleck. So the line was open for business on April 2nd, 1911, with the running of the very first passenger train. And there's the stations on the entire line. There's your Enumclaw Junction to Enumclaw section. And the Enumclaw Courier Herald newspaper had a brief write-up about the new depot, stating that it was 24 by 98 feet and was constructed on the bungalow plan. And they said the waiting rooms were large, well lighted, and pleasant. And the depot had separate men's and women's waiting rooms, interior restrooms, and then a baggage and freight area. And the freight room portion of the depot was elevated 3 feet above the baggage room floor. And the newspaper claims, and this photo seems to bear it out, that the depot was at first painted in a light yellow color. And I know that orange is often described as yellow, but this time it seems to actually have been a yellow. It just seems awfully light. Now that could be something to do with the exposure time with the photographer taking the picture, makes the building look lighter than it does, but it just looks awfully light for orange to me. This seems to be more in tune with what I would expect from a black and white photo. and where the entire depot is painted orange and then maroon trim. And so perhaps the yellow was meant to be a primer to treat the raw wood for the orange and maroon linseed oil finish that was to come. And of course the interior was finished in natural fir. And here's a drawing of it from the building plans. And there was one other depot that was built to this plan that I know of, and that was at Choteau, Montana. And supposedly that one still exists. It was sold to a feed company and turned into a feed store, and is supposed to still exist there. The only difference between the two was that one had drop siding or Dutch siding, and the other had lap siding or clapboard siding. And this one, it shows drop siding, but in the photographs it looks more to me like it has the lap siding, so it must be the one in Choteau that had the drop siding. But here's the floor plan for it. Now this plan's been modified because they turned the men's waiting room into living quarters for the agent. But you can see it had pretty good sized waiting rooms here, and then the interior bathrooms, and then a nice ticket office here with a ticket window in the back, and then a business counter on the side. And then it has a pretty spacious waiting room with a built-in Fairbanks Morse scale. And then the house track came right up to it, and they had this elevated platform where they could load in and out of the box cars. It was the platform was as high as the boxcar floor, and then quite a big platform. And then as a former operator, I'm impressed with this operator's table in the bay window of the depot. It was 3 feet deep by 15.5 feet long. Had lots of drawers for stuff and shelving underneath, and that is a nice table. I have a standard 3 foot by 9 myself, but boy, that is a nice operator's table. And here's the way the plan was laid out here. There was a passing track that came up here, and then the main line, and then your house track that came in alongside the depot. And then this, like I say, this was an elevated platform that was level with the floor of the cars, so that you could load or unload stuff to and from the freight house. And then it was planned to have 2 team tracks here, but they only put in the one. And then the spur into what they're calling Old Pottery, but this was a hay and grain company here. And then this track made a loop around and served a Smith-Welt shingle company and the creamery. Now, with a branch line coming into Moncton and public passengers having to use the depots, Moncton was, up to this time, was just a helper point on the railroad, and so 90% of the traveling public going through were railroad employees. But now that they got the Enumclaw line up and running, and they're constructing another branch line down to Everett, they're going to have a lot of public using their depot facilities to transfer from mainline trains to branch line passenger trains. So they found a need that they were going to have better facilities up here to handle the traveling public. And all they had at this time was this little 12 by 32 foot class D2 portable depot up here. And so in the fall of 1911, they built this nice depot up there. And it was 24 by 102 feet, and built pretty much on the same plan as the Enumclaw Depot. Had separate men's and women's waiting rooms. It had interior bathrooms. It didn't have an elevated freight room, but it did have this open air waiting room on the end here. You can see the benches here for the passengers. And so this was opened in October of 1911 to replace the portable depot. But it wasn't very many months longer that the city of Seattle watershed people persuaded the Milwaukee Road to change the name of the station up here to Cedar Falls. And that's because they had a hydroelectric plant up here on the Cedar River near a falls that they called the Cedar Falls plant. And so they sweetened the deal and made the Milwaukee an offer they couldn't refuse. They put these signs on each end of the depot that spelled out the station name in light bulbs, and then they hooked the depot up to electricity and also the company houses, and then they put this sign up there on the hill behind the depot: Plant Number 1, the Municipal Light and Power System of Seattle, America's Best Lighted City, 40 miles. And I think the Plant Number 1 deal was because they were had developed or were developing another hydroelectric plant at Ross Dam up at Diablo, and that was probably Plant Number 2. And here we see the first passenger train about ready to leave Enumclaw on April 2nd, 1911. And it's sitting at the depot now. The big depot I don't think has been completed at this time, so the agent's probably working out of a temporary depot, like maybe a boxcar depot or something. But we can see the passing track here, and this is Griffin Avenue, and this is 2nd Street, this crossing in front of the engine. And this engine here, the 219, was a G6S 10-wheeler, a 460, and it was built in Milwaukee shops in March of 1907, and it was renumbered 2328 in 1912, and then it was renumbered the 1134 in 1938, and was scrapped in October 1945. As number 2328, it was involved in the wreck at Rainier, Washington on July 3rd, 1915, where the passenger train ran over the trestle over the Northern Pacific that had been just a few minutes earlier had been damaged by the boom of a crane, and the engine and 2 cars dropped through the trestle and resulted in the death of the engine crew and a few passengers. There was only 2 of these G6s out on the Coast Division that I'm aware of. The other one was the 209, and it was built in Milwaukee shops in January of 1907. And the 209 was built with the Stevenson valve gear, and then the 219, built just a couple months later, had the Walschertz valve gear. And these engines were used on the what they called the 3-car local. It was the first passenger service inaugurated in June of 1909. They inaugurated a passenger service between Tacoma and Malden. And so these 2 G6s were used in that passenger service. And then to come after this operation in June of 1911, they're going to inaugurate the Kittitas Local, which was a train that ran from Seattle to Kittitas, laid over until the afternoon, and then made the trip back to Seattle. And it was a local train that would stop and pick up people anywhere they flagged it. and they used these two engines on it, and the engineers at that time was George excuse me, the anyway, George Beardsley was one of the engineers, and then William Emerson was the other one. And they would make the run every other day because of the mileage the accumulated running from Seattle to Kittitas and return. And here we're looking down Griffin Avenue, and the Milwaukee passenger train's about to leave the depot. You can see the depot there, and we can see the Northern Pacific passenger train is in town too. And then in January of 1913, they traded out the steam passenger train for a gas electric motor car, and it still ran on the same schedule which the steam train ran on, which the train would depart Enumclaw in the morning at 7:45 a.m. and run to Moncton, arriving there at 8:43, and then it would turn on the Y and depart for Seattle, arriving there at 10:20 a.m. And then it would leave Seattle at 6:05 p.m., arrive back at Moncton at 7:40 p.m., and then turn on the Y and come back to Enumclaw and get back into here at 8:50 p.m. And so we see the depot again here, and now it has the train order signal, which is bears some comment, because this is the end of a branch line, and on Milwaukee Road lines east, when they had a train order signal at the end of a branch line, they just had the one arm on it for the other direction. This arm wouldn't even be installed because this is the end of the line, and that's true here at Enumclaw. This mainline track only goes 75 feet beyond the end of the depot, so you wonder how often this train order signal was used for anything. Did you have to have a clearance to run past the signal and back into the siding, or what? But anyway, it's interesting picture. You got the dray wagon here, and then there's a can of cream on the baggage cart to be shipped out, and there's a boxcar at the freight house, and then the gas electric motor car, and there's some wagon backed up to that, loading baggage maybe. And anyway, the Milwaukee bought two of these gas electric cars for lines west. The 300 was used on the Everett line as a commuter shuttle service between Everett, Snohomish, and Monroe, and then the 301 was put on the Enumclaw line as the replacement for the Enumclaw Seattle passenger train. Both of them were center entrance cars, whereas the other 5 cars they bought for lines east were rear entrance cars. And this is a pretty grainy picture here, but here we see the 301. Looks like they've gone into the siding to let maybe the Kittitas local run around them. And I don't have any pictures of the way freight out of Enumclaw, but that's his smoke right there behind the train. They're putting a Malley helper on the Olympian at Cedar Falls, but the way freight train would worked out of Cedar Falls, And God, why can't I find my notes here? Anyway, the freight train, the way freight tied up at Cedar Falls overnight and would make the run down to Enumclaw and then back. And when they got back to Cedar Falls, then they would do all the yard switching. And that's what they're doing in this picture here. And it was considered a good job. It was 6 days a week, a daylight job, and the switching was all extra pay. So Bill Keene was the engineer most of the time, even though he had enough seniority to hold a passenger job. But beginning in 1921, the job began tying up at Enumclaw, leaving about 8 a.m. and returning from Cedar Falls about 2 in the afternoon. And then in 1931, it was combined with the Everett Local, with a crew leaving Everett and a crew leaving Enumclaw in the mornings and running to the opposite terminals and then returning the following day. And within a couple of years, the jobs evolved into a nighttime operation, and then it remained so. And for passenger service, the passenger train tied up at Enumclaw, and the crews lived there, and they would arrive at Cedar Falls in the morning and meet the Everett passenger train, and then they would pick up any fares from North Bend, and then both trains would turn on the Y, and the Enumclaw local would depart for Seattle, and the Everett line train would wait for passengers off of the westbound Columbian train number 17, and then it would depart for Everett, and then both passenger trains would meet each other again in the evening and exchange passengers, and then turn on the Y and then depart for their terminals to Enumclaw and North Bend and tie up. And passengers going for the east had about a 1 hour wait for the eastbound Columbia number 18 in the Cedar Falls Depot. And a man named Otto Christensen was the engineer on the Enumclaw passenger train for most of the time that it ran. Now, the another part of the Enumclaw way freight's duties was to switch some spurs that were on the main line. And so this is the Kent Lumber Company spur, and it's right close to Bagley Junction. We can see the name there, and the Bagley Junction switch just out of the frame here. But it was a spur that came off the main line here and ran over a trestle over the Cedar River and then connected to the Kent Lumber Company. And this was how the Milwaukee Road would get loads out of the mill town of Barneston. And here we see a freight bill for a shipment from there, from Kent Lumber Company, and 60,000 pounds of fir lumber. And it was built out of the station of Moncton, December 29th, 1909. And it was built to Guy C. Williams in Kittitas. And now Guy Williams was the brother of H.R. Williams, who was the president of the Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railway. And another spur was the KKK spur. And no, the Klan is not alive and well in the Cedar River watershed. The proper name of this spur was the Krulikoski spur, and it was located a quarter mile west of Trude, but they abbreviated it as the KKK spur. And so here we see the Enumclaw local way freight has gotten his running order out of Cedar Falls to go to Bagley Junction with a side trip to the KKK spur and then return to Bagley Junction. Now, the Enumclaw train would get basically 3 sets of train orders out of Cedar Falls. They would get their running order like this to run from Cedar Falls to Bagley Junction. Then they get another running order to run from Bagley Junction to Enumclaw Junction. And then the agent at Enumclaw would issue another running order for them to run from Enumclaw Junction to Enumclaw. And this is a map that I drew up many, many years ago for a guy named Nate Moldrum in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, that was curious about where the Enumclaw line ran. And so I drew this up as a map to show him where it went from. And so here's Cedar Falls, and then they'd cross the Cedar River and then follow the Cedar River down to Bagley Junction. And then the map I drew here combines the Milwaukee and NP after their line consolidation in 1933. So we have a connection here at Kerriston Junction over to the Northern Pacific's spur that ran up to Kerriston, and then after that the NP abandoned this portion of their line down to Kangley Junction. And then here we have Selleck with the Pacific States Lumber Company's extensive wood spurs, and then the station of Kangley, and then Yandell, and then Kangley Junction. This is now known as the NP Selleck Spur, but this is the old Miller's logging road that went down to connect to Selleck. And then you had the Hiawatha mine and the Big Four mine, and then Durham. And then Canasket Junction was the tail of the Y from Canasket for the NP to get onto their line up to Kerriston. And this dotted green line is the old Northern Pacific line that went up to Kerriston that came off of the main line here at Palmer Junction. Now, the original Northern Pacific line went down through Enumclaw to get to Tacoma. And in 1900, they built what they called the Palmer Cutoff, and they put this line in through Canasket and down to Auburn. And so when they did that, Canasket, they put a Y in there and they just put a long tail on the Y to connect back to the Green River branch. And then they were able to abandon all this. And then the Milwaukee, when they built their line, they utilized some of that grade there. And then the stations of Palmer and the Big Six Coal Company, the Occidental Mine, and then the NP had the Bain Mine Spur that wrapped around this big hill to serve the Carbon, Coke, and Clay Company. And then the Milwaukee also had a connection to that Bain Mine Spur. And then Cumberland, NACO was the National Coal Company, the NP Navy Mine Spur, and Fleet Coal Company. And then down to Vesey, and then I never did get the rest of the map finished. It remains an unfinished project. I was going to comment on the Kerriston line here. You can see it. Must have ran through some pretty rough country because it sure wanders all over the place. Even had a switchback up here at the last leg of it. And at Helmar, they had a connection with the Northwest Lumber Company. And then at Kerriston, they had a connection to the logging railroad of the Preston Mill Company that was owned by a guy from Preston named Lovegrew. And so anyway, here's a picture of the Kerriston line. And I'm assuming this was part of it. And then it drops down across this spectacular big trestle here and then goes through this big cut. And then you can see it going through the woods back there. And the Milwaukee Road wasn't without their troubles with their freight business. We can see here this is a Malley locomotive in the 1940s, and he's come out of the house track. You can see the caboose still sitting back there by the depot, and apparently ran through the switch and derailed here. And they've got the airline coupled up here. There's a jack under the pilot, and so they can raise the locomotive up and then use blocking to work it over to the rails to get it back on the track again. But it's going to take a while. It's a long, slow process. You can see how closely he came to taking out the switch stand. And the passenger service was eliminated early on. It was abolished by November 10th, 1915, but you could still ride on the way freights, 495 and 496, but they tied up overnight at Cedar Falls, and so that would require you to spend the night to be able to return back to Enumclaw. So it wasn't very good service, but they had these cabooses that would accommodate passengers, known as drover cabooses, and I would suspect that most of the passenger service on this line after 1915 was just loggers and miners that wouldn't mind riding in the caboose like that. Here's another one of the drover cabooses that was used on the line. And then the line was dieselized in 1951, just like the Everett line. They used a EMD TR4 A and B cow and calf unit for a while, and then they used a 44 tonner and tried that out, but it didn't have enough pulling power, so they ended up settling on these SW1200 switch engines for the road power. And so seeing the locomotive and caboose tied up here on the house track of the depot was a common sight in the later diesel years. Now the Milwaukee Road left behind both of these pieces of equipment when they pulled out of the west, and the 614 is unique because it was the very first SW1200 ever built, and probably should have been preserved, but it ended up, the last I saw of it, it belonged to Seco, which was a Coast Engine and Equipment Company. It was a locomotive rebuilding company down in Tacoma, and the last I saw the 614 down there, it was all stripped out of parts and getting ready to be scrapped. Now the caboose, the 1931, was immortalized in a painting that appeared in Chuck Woods' book Milwaukee Road West, of this meet, which I assume looks to me like it's around Beverly somewhere, but you got the modernized E23 passenger motor meeting the freight train here, and the caboose is the old 1931. And happily, this caboose did survive. It's part of the Hobo Inn down at Elby, Washington, and so it's a caboose that you can spend the night in. But like I say, this was a common sight to see the SW1200 and a caboose tied up at the old depot. And the old depot is starting to look pretty shabby by this point. And here's the Enumclaw local switching in the Cedar Falls yard. Another part of their duties was to run to Snoqualmie Falls on the Everett branch. and switch the Weyerhaeuser yard, and also to bring back the loads up to Cedar Falls for weighing and then place them in the yard for pickup. And then also carloads of wood chips from the White River Mill were transferred to the Everett Local, and those were destined to Mill A and the Craft Mill in Everett. And then the Enumclaw Local was also bulletined to run up to Ragnar Pit on an as-needed basis to switch out gravel cars. Now, easily the most impressive structure on the line was Bridge FF 706, which was a 125-foot Howe deck truss that was 97 feet above the Green River. And west to east, it consisted of 6 spans of pile trestle approach, and then the 125-foot deck truss, and then 66 spans of pile trestle as the east approach, with an overhead crossing of the Northern Pacific in span number 44. And of course, it was modified over the years, and then around 1958 or so, the Howard Hanson Dam was being constructed, and that was going to flood some of the Northern Pacific's main line. So they had to relocate the Northern Pacific to higher ground, and so then it crossed above the Milwaukee Road's line here, and at that time the Milwaukee Road covered their Howe truss span with sheet metal to prevent fire from any sparks coming down off of the Northern Pacific trains going above. And here we see the local crossing the bridge there. And I think this is a Robert Johnson photo from 1971. And then Ken Albrecht caught it crossing there too with a couple of lumber loads. And Red Griffin used to tell the story about one time when he was on the local, and they were, for some reason, they were double heading with 2 Malley locomotives. And when they got to the Green River Bridge, he brought the train to a stop, and the engineer in the trailing engine, he come up, why'd you stop us? What's wrong? And Red says, do you really want to go across that wooden truss with 2 Malleys coupled together? He thought about it for a second. Yeah, no, I don't. So they uncoupled the lead locomotive and took it across the bridge, and then he waited on the other side for him to bring the train and the other locomotive there, and then they coupled back up and continued their double heading. And the biggest business on the line was the White River Lumber Company. They were the biggest shipper. Later, they were taken over by the Weyerhaeuser Company. But their sawmill was located 3 miles east of Enumclaw at a place called Ellenson. And they cut just rough cut lumber here. And then they had a flume that ran 3 miles down to Enumclaw. And then they had a planing mill there that did the finish lumber and the drying of it. But here we see the mill up at Ellenson. There's their mill pond. And they had a Fairbanks Morse mill switcher. And then they had this caboose, which I think is a Northern Pacific caboose, but with a cupola on it. But Weyerhaeuser added a bay window on each side, so it's a combination cupola and bay window caboose. And then here's your wood chips destined to the paper mills in Everett. And then this is the planing mill down in Enumclaw. And got your water tank there, and this is the engine house, and this was the actual planing mill. Back here they had dry kilns, and then the mold shop here, and then they had 2 sorter sheds. And you can see all the Northern Pacific cars lined up there for loading on that side. And here's a map of Enumclaw so we can get a better idea of the layout. But here's the planing mill operation, and this is the flume, and the Milwaukee had a 1-span pile trestle over the flume. and come in here, and they had the dry kilns. They had a huge platform area, and then the boiler house, the water tank, the mold shop, the engine house, the planer mill, and then a 200-foot and a 217-foot sorter shed, which is where we saw those Northern Pacific cars lined up. And then White River had a spur in on this side for loading, and then their mill office here. And then I should display, I guess the orange is the White River Lumber Company, red is the Milwaukee, and green is Northern Pacific. And we can see the NP facilities up here, their depot, and their passing track, and then the house track, and then their track down here to the White River, and they had a connecting line in there. Now, after 1933, when the Milwaukee gave up their line and started running into Enumclaw on Northern Pacific's line, they put this connection in here for the Milwaukee, so they could come in here and then back into their station. But there was 2 interchange tracks out here for the White River Lumber Company to interchange. I suppose one was for the Milwaukee and one was for Northern Pacific, but they were both 1,200 feet long, and so each railroad could come out here and get their cars, make up their train, and depart. And then we'll look at the Milwaukee here. This is where they come off their use of the White River Lumber Company from Enumclaw Junction and came into the town proper. And they had a passing track here that crossed Griffin Avenue and 3rd Street, and then ran up to the depot here. And then, like I say, the track only went 75 feet past the depot and ended. And then you had a 360-foot house track that came in alongside the depot and along this elevated platform. And then they had 1 team track where they were supposed to put 2 in. And then you had the a shingle warehouse here, and the A&U lumber, and then this 276-foot spur to the hay and feed warehouse there. And then this spur was totally 1,550 feet long, and it curved around and served the Smith-Welt shingle mill, and then the Enumclaw Milk and Cream Company, the creamery. And that creamery changed hands over the years. Later it was an Armour Creamery, and then it became the Enumclaw Cooperative Creamery. And then this spur here was abandoned piecemeal. We can see here it says that that station 1250 was the end of CMST PNP ownership. So they only owned it to this point at that point. And then later it was cut off back here somewhere, and then finally the whole spur was abandoned. And here's the Northern Pacific's depot in the early days. And then here's how it looked in later years. And here's a butter wrapper from the Enumclaw Cooperative Creamery. And there was several small timber operations along the line that shipped carloads of ties and mine timbers. But there was a lot of coal mines located along the line. And although they were small, they produced for many years. And some of them include the Navy Spur at Cumberland, the Big Six Coal Spur, Occidental Coal Spur, the Eureka Mine, the Sunset Mine, Independent Coal and Coke Company, NACO, which was National Coal Company, the Bain Mine, which was that long spur wrapping around the huge hill to serve the Carbon Coke and Clay Company, and the Durham Colliery Company, seen here. And they had a tramway that would bring in coal and coke into their processing plant, and then would deposit it through a hopper system into the cars here to load them. And big changes came to the line in 1933. The two railroads decided to consolidate their lines into one line rather than two parallel lines through the valley. So this map here shows what was put in and what was abandoned. But you have your line down from Cedar Falls to Bagley Junction. And then they put in this connecting track here for the Northern Pacific so they could still get up to Carriston. And that allowed them to abandon this stretch here all the way down to Bagley Junction. And then the Milwaukee kept in the original Seattle Southeastern track down to Selleck. But once you got to Selleck, then they got on to what used to be the Miller's Logging Road, has now become the main line here. And like I say, the Northern Pacific abandoned everything from here. And then the Milwaukee Road abandoned this red section down to Durham. They kept in this track for storage purposes, and also they had a spur here to serve the G&L Logging Company. And then Bagley Junction, which no longer was a junction. And then you had the Hiawatha mine. And then down here they put in a connecting track to get back over onto the Milwaukee's line, and then the Northern Pacific could use the tail of the Y to get down to Canasket on their line. And then this was the Canasket Spur, which originally was called the Stayburg Spur. But then both railroads utilized their own lines through the Palmer area. And then again, the abandonment started here at what they call Bain Junction. And they put a connecting track from the Milwaukee over to the Northern Pacific's line. And then they abandoned all this, including the flyover that the Milwaukee had that went over the top of the Northern Pacific and a county road here. And then all this rest of the Milwaukee was abandoned down through here. You'll notice the two different spellings of VZ. And that was well, Northern Pacific actually spelled it as IE originally, but early on they changed it to EY for some reason. Now, IE is the correct spelling because it comes from the Russell and Vesey Logging Company that was in this area here. But the Milwaukee continued to spell it in the timetables as IE, even though now they were running on the Northern Pacific's line with the station sign plainly spelling it out as EY. And they had a kind of a strange relationship here when they combined these two lines. They also combined the dispatching of it. So every 2 years it would change. The Milwaukee Road would dispatch the whole line to Enumclaw for 2 years, putting out Milwaukee Road train orders to govern the movements. And then it would switch over, and then Northern Pacific would dispatch it and put out the train orders and stuff. And but the Milwaukee Road's timetables that were in effect for those 2 years of thing would still have it spelled as IE, and that spelling error wasn't corrected until timetable number 4 of June 1, 1967. But anyway, there's the connection at Enumclaw Junction. That was the old Milwaukee way of getting in, and they'd run over the White River to get into town proper. And then now they run over and use that connection in there. And here's the timetable page from when that occurred that became effective September 6, 1933. And we see a few new names in the station listings here. We got Carriston Junction now to get over to the NP's Green River branch, and of course Selleck has always been there, and now they're showing it as a crossing of the Pacific States Lumber Company. And then Yandell and Hiawatha Mine, and then of course Durham was always there, but Canasket Junction is a new connection now, and Bain Junction is a new connection, and then the rest of those are pretty much the same. And then this is a page from a condensed profile book, and showing the Milwaukee's line out of Bagley Junction, and there's your connection to Carriston Junction to the NP's line, and then shows their abandoned line beyond that, and then down to Selleck and the Pacific States Lumber Company's trackage in there. And then we can see the Milwaukee line here is abandoned. They just kept in their passing track and some of their main line for storage purposes. And then this would be the old Miller's logging road, is now the main line. And the NP had a siding in here called Kangley. And then this was the NP's abandoned line to Carriston, but this was originally Kangley Junction. I put Old Kangley Junction because there's no junction here anymore, so then they renamed it as Kangley. And then you got the Hiawatha Mine and the Big Four Mine, and then the Durham Colliery spur that we saw a picture of. And they had a block phone telephone system on the line where you would use long and short cranks on the phone to raise the party that you wanted. And they had those phones in Enumclaw Milwaukee Depot and the Enumclaw NP Depot, and at the Canasket NP Depot, and then the Bain section house. And then you could ring up Cedar Falls to get out to the outside. And here we see the local tied up. The old depot building was sold and replaced with a 12-foot by 28-foot steel prefab building, and that was put on the north side of Griffin Avenue on 3rd Street in 1968. And at that time, all the tracks crossing Griffin Avenue on the south side were pulled up. And so here we see the local now would tie up on the pretty near the end of track, just beyond the metal prefab depot building. And when I worked down there on the agency in 1974, this is how the old depot looked. It had been sold off, and it looked like it has now recently been sold again. But it looked like it at one time it was a farmers insurance group in the agent's office, and it looks like they put a front door right through the bay window there. Took out that nice 15-foot telegraph table. Somebody got the Enumclaw station sign off of it too. But this was all vacant when I was there, but the freight house was still operating as a auto parts store. I think it was Napa Auto Parts was working out of there. And then here's a picture I took of the back side of it, and a lot of the orange is showing through. In fact, it looks like they didn't even paint the backside, they just painted what showed. But the roof is getting in pretty bad shape. And then you could find this mill switcher tied up down below every evening. And they had this Fairbanks Morse engine here, and then that strange caboose. Now, somewhere around this time, Weyerhaeuser gave up this locomotive switcher to their Vail operations. And so then, by an agreement with the Milwaukee Road, they had they used the Milwaukee Road's Enumclaw local power, their SW1200, to switch the mill. And then when they were done, they would top the engine off with diesel fuel every day, and then the Milwaukee crew would take the unit at night up to Cedar Falls and Snoqualmie Falls to do their switching with it. And the railroad group out in Snoqualmie acquired this locomotive, and they also had this caboose. So they had this set here. Now they've restored this engine back beautifully to its original appearance as the White River mill switcher. But the last time I saw this caboose, it was in really bad shape from sitting outside, so I would imagine it ended up getting scrapped. And during the hot summer months, they towed this fire car around with them in case they set a fire anywhere, they could get it put out quickly. So it was sitting down in the storage yard, so I went down and took some pictures of it. And so the agency here was, well, Warren Childers was the agent when I relieved down there, and he retired on August 30th, 1974. And then Harry Dahl bid the job in. And when he did that, that was the kiss of death for the Enumclaw agency, because Harry was known for every time he bid an agency, and it seemed like the Milwaukee Road would close that station. And he was the last agent at Ellensburg. He was the last agent at Squim. And now he's about to be the last agent at Enumclaw, because they closed this agency on Friday, June 20th, 1975. And so here we see Harry Dahl standing outside the metal prefab depot. Now, after they closed the agency here, they still had the Enumclaw local working out of here, so they would obtain their train orders from the Burlington Northern depot. And here's what it looked like. And there was a guy named Gene Tice that was the agent here at that time. And the old depot building was demolished in July of 1978. And then that prefab depot was moved in March of 1977 over to Tukey's on the Olympic Peninsula for use as an office for the section foreman there. And then the Enumclaw local train was abolished on Friday, April 16th, 1976. And then the Snoqualmie turn that we see here on the Snoqualmie River Bridge on the Everett line, and he's going down to switch the Snoqualmie Falls mill yard. And this is a Ken Seacrest photo, but anyway, the Snoqualmie turn was then bulletined to run to Enumclaw on Saturdays. And so they would, 5 days a week, the Snoqualmie turn would have this road power. And then on Saturdays, it would have a SW1200 for power in case it had to run up to the Enumclaw line to get any business up there. But that only lasted for about 6 weeks. And then on May 29th, 1976, the final train ran to Enumclaw. And then that ended the line. And then a couple of years later, they started to pick up the line. So myself and Don Lair, who was a dispatcher out of Tacoma, and Jerry Brickschneider, who was a fellow operator at Cedar Falls, decided to hike the line because we were all three curious as to how this line really worked. It was kind of a confusing line with the two railroads combining it, and none of us were sure how it laid out. So we decided to hike the line. So we hiked it from Bagley Junction all the way to Cedar Falls in July of 1978. And Here's the Green River Bridge with the Northern Pacific Bridge running over the top of it. And you can see that they've already picked up the rails all the way across the bridge. And here's a view looking down off the side of the bridge into the Green River. And here's a view from inside the Howe Truss. And here's a view from the very top of the Northern Pacific's bridge looking down onto the Milwaukee's Green River Bridge. And then this is a switch at Cascade Junction. This is where that tail of the Y came up from Cascade and connected to the line. And we can see that the frog and stuff had been pulled up here, but they left the points here with a switch stand attached to them still. So I don't know why they didn't abandon the whole switch, but and then this is more of that Y spur from Cascade, and this was the Northern Pacific yard limit sign buried in stinging nettles. And then here's the right-of-way, and the rails are still down in here, but they haven't run over them for a long, long time. And then this was the Selleck siding, and this is that old Miller's logging road, and this was originally the Kangley siding for the Northern Pacific, but now it's the Selleck siding. And that's Don Lair, the train dispatcher there, and then Jerry Brettschneider's head got in the view. And then this is a view from the Taylor River Bridge on the Enumclaw line, looking down onto the main line at Bagley Junction. And then this is that Taylor River Bridge that I just took the photo off of. And this bridge was causing the watershed people to lose sleep at night. They wanted this bridge removed because of the creosote in the pilings and stuff was contaminating their stream. And I think they've finally done that, but they talked about it for years and years that they were going to get this bridge out of there, and it never happened. And then we had the Dodge watershed patrols along the line, otherwise we would be subject to arrest. But they were easy to avoid because they had pickup trucks with tailgates that would rattle on the rough roads, so we'd hear them coming a long ways away, and we'd just lay down flat on the railroad tracks and wait for their patrol to go by. But I was amazed at how many roads they had and how close those roads came to the railroad tracks. It just looked like woods there when you were walking through it, and then all of a sudden here comes their patrol vehicles. But we managed to avoid them. I bet you can't do that today. They probably have ground penetrating radar and everything else up there to detect anybody in the area. But anyway, here's myself and Don Lair hamming it up at Bagley Junction. The signs had been taken down, and the switch to the main line had been pulled up, and so we're posing with a couple of the Bagley Junction signs. Now, I acquired these signs because the Cedar Falls signal maintainer, Andy Brettschneider, asked me one day if I wanted them. He said that they were, just laying down there. I said, sure, I'll take them. So one day he threw them on his push car behind his speeder, and I was living in the company house up at Cedar Falls, and he swung by and threw them off in my yard. And so the one we're holding I have in my shed here up in Darrington now, and then I passed the other one on to Ken Seacrest, so it's probably hanging in his garage in Montana somewhere. But and I wanted to end on a positive note here about Bagley Junction. There was a time when it was really foggy. Northern Pacific local was working its way up the line, and they missed their switch in the fog. And I'm assuming they probably was meaning to go into Carriston Junction. to go into switch the mill town of Barneston, but they missed the switch in the fog and they ended up down here at Bagley Junction. So they went to the phone booth here and rang up the dispatcher and told them where they were and where they were trying to get to. And the dispatcher patiently explained to them where they'd missed their switch and how to get back to where they were going. So instead of turning them in for being on a section of railroad they weren't supposed to be on and had no authority to be on, he understood their predicament and helped them out of it. So that was the kind of cooperation that they had between the two railroads back in the day. And so anyway, this concludes my program on the Enumclaw line. I hope that you learned some new things about it, and I hope you enjoyed the program. And I thank you very much for watching it.
Good stuff, Alan.
Thank you.
Yeah, when we have a moment here, I had a few questions. The type of coal that they got out of the hillsides there, was that like a semi-bituminous or something like that? Do you know?
No, I don't know the grade of it. No, but
Okay.
I know the Northern Pacific. It was good coal, I think, because they seem to uh, build their branch lines into these good coal districts.
Yeah. Also that photo you have there at the White River facility, that caboose that's coupled next to the Fairbanks Morse engine in that close-up looks like it's a Northern Pacific shorty caboose, and then they attached the bay window caboose, or is it a Milwaukee caboose?
No, I believe that was a Northern Pacific caboose, and
Okay,
then Weyerhaeuser modified it by putting bay windows on it.
I see.
Yeah, it is kind of it's kind of like a belts and suspenders caboose, where you've got both the cupola and the bay window. So, Dave Sprau has got his hand up. Perfect, Dave. And can you unmute and come on camera? Because I've got a question for you too. There's our fourth panelist.
Alan, that was very good. I learned a thing or two, and you didn't get, I lived within a few miles of that area for 35 years, and I've been all over all of that. And you didn't get anything wrong, and I learned a thing or two. It's very good. The only thing that I can say is in my efforts over the years to try to explain those very same things to people, there is so much that happened there and so many changes and so much stuff going on that it's almost impossible to avoid, no matter how hard you try, to avoid information overload. You did as good as anybody could do, and I'm not sure if I'm not sure if it would be possible for anybody to absorb it all at one sitting. I would suggest this is going to be on YouTube. Watch this about 4 times and take notes on different parts, and then you'll maybe get it down, because this is a lot of stuff.
Well, yeah, and I know myself, I've been up there a few times and I just get massively confused. And so this really is you're right, Dave. I mean, I need to watch it a couple times, but I know that the answer is in here. And Alan is of course, I was a geography major before I became an accountant. And that map that you drew was that was really cool. And I was so impressed by that.
That was better. That was better than any amount of talking as far as the map goes, but you still have to have the map explained because it's just so detailed. There's just so much going on. By the way, Alan, before I forget though, that caboose, I think that caboose, could be wrong, but I think that caboose wound up being donated to the Black Diamond Historical Society, and they got it over there, if I remember correctly, and discovered that it was in such terrible shape that all they could save was the trucks and the running gear. And they got a set of blueprints for that caboose and completely, totally reconstructed it in kind. And it now sits in front of the Black Diamond Depot
Oh,
Museum.
that's good news.
That's good news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hope I'm not wrong about that. I know they had to do that with a caboose, and I think it was this one.
Okay,
Art?
yeah, because I lost track of it. Like I said, when I saw it, it was looking in pretty sad shape at Snoqualmie.
Yeah,
I had a, go ahead.
I'm sure of that. But anyway, well, I'm as sure can be without being wrong. That's really all I have to say. You did a really good job. You covered everything, and I learned a thing or two and went on information overload, just like everybody that I try to explain this stuff to does. And I mean that as a compliment.
The other question I had was the photo of the number 90 there at Enumclaw on the ground. I just looked it up in the wing book here, and the photo is by a guy named Bill Umek, but Frank Kobe had apparently, did he have all those photos in his collection? Is that how you?
Yeah, I believe so. That's where I got them from, was through Frank Kobe.
Uh-huh. Well, they're good photos, and the ones that you displayed really filled out that whole story rather than just having the one view of it on the ground. And where is that at in Enumclaw? Is it near the depot or where's that at?
Yeah, you can see the depot behind there. They had just come out of the house track, and I don't know if the switch wasn't properly lined or if they just derailed as they were coming out onto the main line there.
Or broke a rail, or did
Embarrassed.
something like that. Yeah. So, Dave Sprau,
Umek lived. Hey,
Dave Sprau, I have a
Umek
question
lived at
for you. And
Yeah,
that
can you
is
hear
the
me?
train order signal in Enumclaw on the BN depot. What kind of train order signal was that?
Upper quad. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
That was an upper quadrant semaphore signal, and it was displayed in the 19 position for a westbound train. In other words, somebody going towards Tacoma. There weren't any through train operations in the. Well, I suppose there could have been. Yeah, that local could have gone out to VZ and then was coming back and going toward Tacoma. So maybe there's legitimately displayed train order signal. That depot was torn down in about 1961 or 2 or 3 or somewhere in there, and replaced with a metal depot. Umek was a photographer who lived at Palmer. And one other thing, Alan, I want to contribute here. The NP trains that shared the use of that line and would go up to Selleck, and then they'd go, like you described, try to find their way up to Halmar and Kerriston and stuff. Sometimes when they would come back, they would ask for orders via Palmer so they could use the Milwaukee side of that line rather than going into Canasket and using their main line and then up to Palmer Junction and then back over to Bain. They would just ask to use the Milwaukee line because it's much quicker to get back to Enumclaw that way.
Yeah, more direct route. Yeah.
Yeah.
In other words, they could, if they wanted to, run over that track, even though the only reason to do so was expedience. They had no industries between Canasket Junction and Bain that they could serve, but they still had running rights over the track.
So they'd have to get orders to go on the Milwaukee side and occupy that?
Well, they'd have to get orders. It depended whether the Milwaukee or the NP was fully in charge of the line. I worked on the NP for a while when we had that line and issued all those orders to Milwaukee trains. It was one or the other, but not both.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, you would have dispatched it back in the day, wouldn't you have? Would that be on the Mountain Division?
No, it was attached to the double track north because the line originated at Meeker and then went up to Buckley and Enumclaw.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
In my day, it only went as far as Bagley Junction, but I remember working with operator Ella Lindoff at Cedar Falls and putting out running orders for their Enumclaw local in the morning to go back to run over the line. Every 2 years, we had complete control of the line on the NP, and every 2 years, the Milwaukee had complete control of it and issued all of the train orders for everything.
All right. Well, I want to thank Alan for another wonderful detailed program on this time Milwaukee Road Enumclaw branch, otherwise known as the White River branch. And today is November 28th, 2025. And I want to thank also our panelists, Dave Sprau and George Foster, the bishops, and I want to again, and Alan, of course. And I'm your host and moderator, Jonathan Fischer, saying thanks very much for watching, and you'll be able to watch this program on YouTube later today. And in between now and then, all I can say is bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you.